Hello and welcome Cheating Tales Lab. We really appreciate you stopping by. Today's tale is full of twists and turns that you're sure to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let's get into it. John Warren stood before the city council, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. At 45, he was in his prime as an architect, and this moment felt like the culmination of years of hard work and dedication. The innovative design for a sustainable community center he was presenting wasn't just another project. It was his passion, his vision for bringing people together in a space that could truly make a difference. As he spoke, his enthusiasm was palpable. Each word carried the weight of countless hours of planning, designing, and refining. The council members leaned forward, clearly engaged by John's presentation. When he finished, a palpable silence filled the room before the mayor broke into a warm smile. "Mr. Warren, your vision is exactly what this city needs," she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine admiration. "We'll be in touch soon with our final decision." John nodded, trying to keep his expression professional despite the surge of triumph he felt inside. As he gathered his materials, he could hear the council members murmuring among themselves, their tones positive and excited. He allowed himself a small smile as he left the chamber. The crisp autumn air hit John's face as he stepped outside, grounding him after the intensity of the presentation. He took a deep breath, savoring the moment. This project could be the one to cement his legacy, to truly make a mark on the city he loved. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. John pulled it out, expecting a congratulatory message from Ruby, his wife of 15 years. Instead, the text he saw made his heart sink slightly. "Working late again. Don't wait up," John sighed, pocketing the phone without replying. It wasn't the first time Ruby had sent such a message, and lately, they seemed to be coming more frequently. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered that something wasn't right, but he pushed it away. Their relationship had been strained recently, but he attributed it to the stress of his big project. Once things settled down, they'd have time to reconnect. Little did John know, the storm brewing in his personal life would soon make his professional triumphs seem insignificant in comparison. Later that evening, John sat in his home office, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his focused expression. He was reviewing some final tweaks to his design, determined to perfect every detail. The house was quiet, Ruby's absence a tangible thing in the stillness. Needing to send an urgent email to a colleague, John realized he'd left his laptop in the car. Rather than trudge outside, he decided to use the shared computer in the living room. As he sat down, he noticed Ruby had left her account logged in. He was about to sign out when a message caught his eye. It was from Ruby to her mother, and the content made his blood run cold. "Once I have enough of his money in my own account, I'll leave him and tell the police he abused our housekeeper. That should put him away for a long time." John stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The woman he'd loved and trusted for 15 years was plotting to destroy him. In an instant, his world shattered. The future he'd imagined, building his career, growing old with Ruby, crumbled to dust. For a moment, white-hot anger coursed through his veins. He wanted to confront Ruby, to demand answers, to shake her until she explained how she could betray him like this. But as quickly as the rage came, it subsided, replaced by a cold, calculated fury. John forced himself to remain calm. He knew he needed to act strategically. Over the next few days, John became a master of deception. On the surface, he maintained his usual routine, going to work, discussing the community center project, even sharing meals with Ruby when their schedules aligned. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, he was meticulously gathering evidence. He discovered Ruby had been siphoning money from their joint accounts into a secret one under her maiden name. The amounts were small enough not to raise immediate suspicion, but over time, they had accumulated into a substantial sum. John's jaw clenched as he realized how long this betrayal must have been in the works. But the financial deception was just the beginning. As John dug deeper, he uncovered a trove of text messages between Ruby and her lover, James Vega. James was a smooth-talking real estate agent they'd met at a charity gala last year. John remembered how Ruby had gushed about James' charm and business acumen. Now, reading their intimate exchanges, he felt sick. Their messages revealed not just a passionate affair, but a carefully orchestrated plan to ruin John. They discussed how to manipulate their friends into believing John was abusive, how to stage evidence, and how to ensure Ruby would come out of the divorce with as much money as possible. With each new piece of evidence, John's resolve hardened. He'd built his career on creating spaces that brought people together, but now he was preparing for a battle that would tear his life apart. The irony wasn't lost on him. Knowing he needed more than just digital evidence, John hired a private investigator to follow Ruby and James. The PI returned with a file of damning photographs. Ruby and James in intimate embraces, entering hotels together, sharing secretive meetings in out-of-the-way cafes. Each image was like a knife to John's heart, but he forced himself to study them dispassionately. These would be crucial in the fight ahead. Armed with this mountain of evidence, John contacted his lawyer, Wade Potter. Wade had been a friend for years, and John trusted him implicitly. When John laid out the situation, Wade's usually jovial face turned grim. "John, this is serious," Wade said, his voice low and urgent as he reviewed the evidence. "We need to move quickly and decisively. If what you've uncovered is true, and it certainly seems to be, Ruby and James could destroy your life if they act first." Together, they formulated a plan. John would drain Ruby's secret account, gather all evidence of her plot and the affair, and disappear before she could enact her scheme. It was a risky move, but staying put was even riskier. "Are you sure about this, John?" Wade asked, concern evident in his eyes. "Once you set this in motion, there's no going back. Your life as you know it will be over." John met his friend's gaze steadily. "My life as I knew it ended the moment I read that email, Wade. Now it's about survival, and making sure justice is served." Wade nodded, impressed by John's resolve. "All right then, let's get to work." The next few days were a blur of activity. John moved money, compiled evidence, and made discreet arrangements for his disappearance. All the while, he maintained a facade of normalcy around Ruby, even as every smile she gave him, every casual touch, made his skin crawl. Finally, everything was in place. John packed a small bag with essentials, his heart heavy but his determination unwavering. As he zipped up the bag, he heard Ruby's key in the lock. For a moment, panic gripped him. Had she somehow discovered his plan? But there was no time for doubt. John slipped out the back door, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he walked away from the house he'd called home for over a decade, he didn't look back. His old life was over, but he was determined to come out on top. In the growing darkness, John Warren disappeared into the night, leaving behind a life built on lies and stepping into an uncertain future. But for the first time since discovering Ruby's betrayal, he felt a glimmer of hope. The storm was coming, but he was ready to weather it. Ruby Warren's heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she entered the empty house. The silence that greeted her was unusual, even unsettling. "John," she called out, her voice echoing through the rooms. No response. A frown creased her perfectly made-up face as she moved from room to room, each one as empty and silent as the last. Something was off. John was always home at this hour, usually buried in his work in the home office. As the realization that John was indeed gone sank in, a cold tendril of fear wormed its way into Ruby's stomach. She rushed to their shared computer, fingers flying over the keyboard as she logged into their joint accounts. Her eyes widened in shock, mouth falling open as she stared at the screen. The accounts had been drained. Every last cent, gone. "That bastard," she hissed, hands clenching into fists. "He knows." Panic rising in her throat, Ruby grabbed her phone and dialed James with trembling fingers. He picked up on the second ring. "He knows," she spat into the phone, not bothering with pleasantries. "That bastard took everything and disappeared." James's smooth voice came through the line, tinged with confusion. "Whoa, slow down, baby. What are you talking about?" "John." Ruby nearly screamed. "He's gone, James. And he took all the money with him. He must have found out about our plan." There was a moment of silence on the other end. When James spoke again, his voice had lost its usual cockiness. "I'll be right there." 20 minutes later, James Vega strode into the Warren residence, his tailored suit and slicked-back hair a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. Ruby was pacing the living room, her earlier composure completely shattered. "We need to find him before he goes to the police," James said, his own arrogance replaced by a palpable fear. He ran a hand through his hair, messing up its perfect arrangement. Ruby whirled on him, eyes flashing. "No," she snapped. "We stick to the plan. We'll say he abused the housekeeper and fled. It's our word against his." James stared at her, momentarily taken aback by her vehemence. "But Ruby, if he has evidence, he doesn't—" Ruby cut him off. "He can't." We were careful, but even as she said the words, doubt crept into her voice. Had they been careful enough? Little did Ruby and James know, their every word was being recorded. John, always meticulous in his planning, had installed hidden cameras throughout the house before his departure. Their panicked conversation was providing even more damning evidence against them. As Ruby and James continued to argue, their voices rising and falling in waves of accusation and fear, the cameras silently captured it all. John's foresight was proving to be their undoing. Each word they spoke another nail in the coffin of their scheme. Meanwhile, across town, John Warren was checking into a small, nondescript motel under an assumed name. The room was a far cry from the luxurious home he'd shared with Ruby, but it would serve its purpose. John set his bag down on the worn carpet and took a seat at the rickety desk. From his bag, he pulled out a laptop and a stack of folders. Despite the turmoil in his personal life, John was determined not to let Ruby and James's betrayal derail his career. Over the next few days, John divided his time between meticulously organizing the evidence against Ruby and James and focusing on his community center project. The work provided a welcome distraction from the pain of betrayal, allowing him to channel his emotions into something productive. As he pored over blueprints and design specifications, John's mind occasionally wandered to Ruby and James. He wondered what they were doing, how they were reacting to his disappearance. A part of him, the part that still ached from their betrayal, hoped they were suffering. But John pushed those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past. He had a future to secure, both personally and professionally. Back at the Warren residence, Ruby and James were putting their plan into action. They had decided to go to the police, spinning a tale of John's alleged abuse and sudden disappearance. Ruby had spent hours practicing her story in front of the mirror, perfecting the right mix of fear and vulnerability. James had coached her, drawing on his experience in sales to help her craft a convincing narrative. As they sat in the police station, waiting to speak with a detective, Ruby leaned close to James. "Remember," she whispered, "stick to the story. No matter what they ask, don't deviate." James nodded, his jaw set in determination. He reached out and squeezed Ruby's hand, a gesture of reassurance that was captured by the security cameras overhead. Detective Kane Hamilton entered the room, his weathered face set in a neutral expression. He'd seen countless cases of domestic abuse over his career, but something about this one felt off from the start. "Mrs. Warren," he began, his tone professional but not unkind, "can you tell me what happened?" Ruby launched into her prepared story, her voice trembling at all the right moments. She painted a picture of John as a monster, a man who presented a charming face to the world while terrorizing those at home. He would get so angry," Ruby said, her eyes welling with carefully practiced tears. "The smallest things would set him off. But he was always so careful not to leave marks where people could see." James nodded solemnly, playing the part of the supportive friend. "I had no idea," he added. "John always seemed so calm and collected in public." Detective Hamilton listened, his expression unchanging. Years of experience had taught him to reserve judgment until he had all the facts. And something about this case was raising red flags. "Mrs. Warren," he said when Ruby had finished her tale, "these are serious allegations. We'll need to speak with your housekeeper." Ruby paled slightly, her composure slipping for just a moment. "Of course," she said, her voice wavering. She's very traumatized. It might take some time to convince her to come forward." Detective Hamilton's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The hesitation in Ruby's voice, the quick glance she shared with James, it all added to his growing suspicion that there was more to this story than met the eye. I understand, he said carefully. Please let us know as soon as she's ready to talk. Her testimony will be crucial to our investigation. As Ruby and James left the police station, they felt a mix of relief and anxiety. They had taken the first step in their plan, but the detective's questions had unsettled them both. Do you think he believed us? James asked as they walked to the car. Ruby shot him a glare. Of course he did. We were convincing. Now we just need to figure out what to do about the housekeeper. What Ruby and James didn't know was that their plan was already beginning to unravel. While they had been spinning their tale to Detective Hamilton, John had made his move. From his motel room, John had sent an anonymous tip to Detective Hamilton, along with a portion of the evidence he'd gathered. The package included financial records showing Ruby's embezzlement, text messages between Ruby and James discussing their affair and their plot against John, and a sample of the video footage from the hidden cameras in the house. When Detective Hamilton returned to his desk after interviewing Ruby and James, he found the package waiting for him. As he went through its contents, his eyes widened in disbelief. The evidence painted a completely different picture than the one Ruby and James had presented. Without wasting a moment, Detective Hamilton picked up his phone and dialed. Mrs. Warren, Mr. Vega, I need you to come back to the station immediately, he said, his tone now stern and authoritative. There are some inconsistencies in your statements that we need to discuss. Ruby and James exchanged nervous glances as they sat once again in the interview room. The detective's demeanor had changed dramatically since their last meeting. Gone was the sympathetic listener. In his place sat a man who looked like he was about to spring a trap. Mrs. Warren, Mr. Vega, Detective Hamilton began, his voice cool and professional. I have some questions about your earlier statements. There seem to be some inconsistencies that I'd like to clear up. Ruby forced a confused smile. Of course, Detective. We want to help in any way we can. What seems to be the problem? Detective Hamilton laid out a series of documents on the table. Can you explain these bank transfers, Mrs. Warren? Large sums of money being moved from your joint accounts with Mr. Warren to an account under your maiden name. Ruby's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. James jumped in, his salesman's instincts kicking in. Detective, I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for. I'm not finished, Mr. Vega. Hamilton cut him off sharply. He then produced a stack of printed text messages. Perhaps you'd like to explain these exchanges between the two of you? They seem to detail quite a different story than the one you told me earlier. As Ruby and James sat in stunned silence, their carefully constructed plan crumbling around them, Detective Hamilton continued to lay out the evidence. With each new revelation, their demeanor shifted from confident to panicked. I think it's time you told me the truth, Hamilton said finally, leaning back in his chair. The real truth, this time. Ruby and James exchanged a look of desperation. They were cornered, and they both knew it. Their perfect plan, the one they had been so sure would succeed, had fallen apart in a matter of hours. As they began to stammer out explanations and excuses, Detective Hamilton allowed himself a small, grim smile. Justice, it seemed, had a way of revealing itself, no matter how clever the deception. John Warren stepped out of his rental car, his eyes scanning the familiar streets of the city he'd called home for so long. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions and calculated moves, but now it was time to face the storm he'd set in motion. He straightened his tie and walked purposefully towards the police station. The weight of the evidence he carried felt like both a burden and a shield. As he pushed open the heavy glass doors, John steeled himself for what was to come. Detective Kane Hamilton looked up from his desk as John approached. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a mix of curiosity and relief. Mr. Warren, the detective said, rising to greet him. I'm glad you came in. We have a lot to discuss. John nodded, his face a mask of determination. Indeed we do, Detective. I believe I have some information that will shed light on recent events. Detective Hamilton ushered John into a private interview room. As they settled into their seats, John began to lay out the entire story. He spoke clearly and concisely, his emotions tightly controlled as he revealed the depth of Ruby and James' betrayal. He produced document after document, each piece of evidence more damning than the last. bank statements showing Ruby's embezzlement, text messages detailing the affair and their plot, photographs from the private investigator, and finally, the video recordings from the hidden cameras in their home. As John presented his case, Detective Hamilton listened intently. His expression shifted from skepticism to shock, and finally to a grudging respect for the man sitting before him. "Mr. Warren," Hamilton said when John had finished, "I've been a detective for over 20 years, and I've never seen a case quite like this. The level of deception you've uncovered, it's staggering." John's jaw tightened. "They thought they could destroy me, Detective. They underestimated how far I'd go to protect myself." Hamilton nodded, understanding the steel behind John's words. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said finally, his tone genuinely sympathetic. "Rest assured, we'll be pursuing charges against your wife and Mr. Vega. Conspiracy, fraud, attempting to pervert the course of justice. They're looking at serious time." John felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice was in motion. The fear and anger that had driven him for weeks began to ebb, replaced by a sense of vindication. As he left the station, John took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. For the first time since discovering Ruby's betrayal, he felt like he could breathe freely. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it head-on. The next morning, John found himself once again standing before the city council. This time, however, the stakes felt different. His community center project, once just a professional aspiration, had become a lifeline, a beacon of hope amidst the chaos of his personal life. As he began his presentation, John pushed aside thoughts of Ruby, James, and the ongoing investigation. He focused entirely on his vision for the community center, pouring all of his passion and expertise into every word. The council members listened attentively, their expressions a mix of interest and something else. Was it admiration? John realized that news of his personal ordeal must have reached them, adding an extra layer of context to his presentation. As he concluded, a hush fell over the room. John held his breath, waiting for the council's response. To his surprise, the mayor stood up, a warm smile on her face. "Mr. Warren," she began, her voice filled with genuine respect, "in light of recent events that have come to our attention, we want to commend your strength and integrity. Your dedication to this project, despite the personal challenges you've faced, is truly admirable." John felt a lump form in his throat, but he maintained his composure, meeting the mayor's gaze steadily. "Your vision for this community center is exactly what our city needs," the mayor continued. "It's not just about the building itself, but about the spirit behind it, the desire to bring people together, to create something positive in the face of adversity. Mr. Warren, I'm pleased to inform you that your project is approved." The room erupted in applause. John stood there, momentarily stunned by the turn of events. As the reality of the moment sank in, a sense of triumph washed over him. His professional dream was becoming a reality, even as his personal life had crumbled. In that moment, John realized that his dedication and resilience had seen him through both challenges. As the council members came forward to congratulate him, John allowed himself a small smile. He had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. Weeks passed, and John threw himself into the early stages of the community center project. The work provided a welcome distraction from the ongoing legal proceedings against Ruby and James. He immersed himself in blueprints and contractor meetings, finding solace in the tangible progress of his vision taking shape. But the day of reckoning couldn't be postponed forever. On a crisp morning in late autumn, John found himself standing in a crowded courtroom, watching as Ruby and James were led in, their hands cuffed behind their backs. The trial had been swift and decisive. The mountain of evidence John had gathered left little room for doubt. As the judge prepared to deliver the verdict, John studied the faces of the two people who had once meant everything to him. Ruby looked pale and drawn, her usually immaculate appearance now haggard. James, stripped of his arrogance, seemed small and defeated. As the judge pronounced them guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and attempting to pervert the course of justice, John felt no satisfaction, only a profound sense of closure. As Ruby and James were led away, Ruby caught John's eye. "I'm sorry," she mouthed, her face a mask of regret and fear. John simply turned away. He had no words for her, no forgiveness to offer. Their chapter was closed, and he was ready to move on. Leaving the courthouse, John's eyes were drawn to a construction site across the street. The foundation of his community center was being laid, the skeleton of the building beginning to take shape. It struck him as a powerful symbol, new beginnings rising from the ashes of betrayal and deceit. That evening, John sat in his new apartment, a glass of whiskey in hand. The space was smaller than the house he'd shared with Ruby, but it felt more like home. As he looked out over the city skyline, he reflected on the brutal journey he'd endured. He had lost his wife and the life he'd known, but he'd maintained his integrity. He'd faced betrayal and come out stronger, more resilient. The man who sat here now was not the same one who had stood before the city council all those weeks ago, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. As John sipped his whiskey, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future, he realized, was full of possibilities. He had his health, his career, and a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. Setting down his glass, John turned to his drafting table, where the latest plans for the community center lay spread out. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And John Warren was ready for all of it.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.